The screaming began at dawn, not the usual sounds of a village waking, the bleating of goats, the call of merchants, the laughter of children chasing each other through narrow streets. This was different. This was the sound of mothers who had just watched their sons ripped from their arms. The sound of steel meeting flesh, the sound of a king's paranoia, made manifest in the bodies of babies whose blood now stained the cobblestones of Bethlehem. But to understand why the streets of David's ancient city ran red that morning in 4 BCE, you must first understand the man who ordered it. You must descend into the diseased mind of Herod the Great, a title soaked in bitter irony, a name that would echo through history not for greatness, but for genocide. Herod was dying, and he knew it. The disease consuming him had no mercy. Ancient historians would later describe it in gruesome detail, his body putrefying while he still drew breath, his flesh rotting from the inside out, the stench of decay following him through the corridors of his palace. Modern scholars suspect chronic kidney disease compounded by Fournier's gangrene, a condition so excruciatingly painful that Herod once attempted to take his own life with a knife, only to be stopped by his cousin. Even death, it seemed, would not come when called. But physical agony was nothing compared to the torment of his mind. For 33 years, Herod had ruled Judea as Rome's puppet king, a man of Idumean blood, Arab on both sides, whose family's conversion to Judaism fooled no one. He was not of David's line. He possessed no legitimate claim to the throne beyond Roman swords and political cunning. Every day of his reign was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide of Jewish messianic expectation threatened constantly to wash it away. So he had become a monster to protect his throne. The list of his murders read like a catalogue of hell. In 35 BCE, he had ordered his 18-year-old brother-in-law Aristobulus drowned in the swimming pool at his winter palace in Jericho, made to look like an accident, though everyone knew the truth. In 29 BCE, he executed his beloved wife Mariamne, the Hasmonean princess whose royal blood he had married to legitimize his rule, on false charges of adultery. Her mother Alexandra followed a year later. His own sons Alexander and Aristobulus were strangled in 7 BCE after a trial orchestrated by their father's paranoia. And just days before his own death, he would order the execution of his eldest son Antipater, buried without ceremony at the fortress of Hyrcania. The Roman Emperor Augustus famously quipped, "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son," a bilingual pun noting that as a Jew, Herod would never kill a pig, but thought nothing of killing his children. Herod maintained power through a network of terror, 2,000 personal guards, secret police monitoring every whisper in every marketplace, torture chambers in fortresses like Hyrcania and Machaerus, informants in every village. Anyone suspected of disloyalty simply disappeared. Josephus, the Jewish historian who chronicled this era, recorded execution after execution. 45 members of the Sanhedrin killed in one purge. 300 military officers in another, rabbis and students, burned alive for destroying the golden Roman eagle Herod had placed above the temple gate. The palace in Jerusalem, where Herod now lay dying, was a monument to his dual obsessions, architectural grandeur and military security. He had spent decades and fortunes building the impossible, expanding the Temple Mount into one of the ancient world's wonders, constructing the harbor city of Caesarea Maritima with its revolutionary underwater concrete, carving the fortress of Masada from a mountain, creating his tomb fortress at Herodium. These projects employed thousands, impressed Rome, and, most importantly, kept the people distracted while he consolidated power. But building projects couldn't quiet the whispers. The Messiah is coming, the King of Kings, the one prophesied by David, born in Bethlehem, the legitimate heir who would restore Israel's glory. These whispers haunted Herod's dreams. The Pharisees had openly prophesied that his dynasty would fall. The scrolls of the prophets, read aloud every Sabbath in every synagogue, promised a king from Bethlehem who would shepherd Israel. How could Herod rest when every Jewish hope centered on a figure destined to replace him? He was a man obsessed by the fear of a claimant to his petty throne. Modern psychologists examining the historical record diagnose him with paranoid personality disorder, a clinical term that hardly captures the depth of his murderous madness. He saw threats everywhere, because threats were everywhere. His reign existed at Roman pleasure, and the moment Rome decided he was more trouble than he was worth, he would be discarded like all client kings before him. So when the Magi arrived, Herod's carefully constructed world began to crack. They came from the east, Persia perhaps, or Babylon, learned men who studied the heavens and interpreted the movements of stars. The text in Matthew 2:1-2 records their arrival with deceptive simplicity. Wise men from the east came to Jerusalem saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." King of the Jews. Those words detonated in Herod's court like a declaration of war. Matthew 2:3 records the immediate response. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. The Greek word used, eterachthea, suggests profound disturbance, violent agitation. Herod didn't just worry. He convulsed with rage and fear. All Jerusalem trembled with him, because when Herod felt threatened, people died. The Magi were ushered into Herod's presence with all the false courtesy of a spider welcoming flies. Herod's mind worked quickly, calculating angles, assessing threats. These foreigners spoke of a star, astronomical signs that had led them to Judea. They sought a newborn king. Newborn. That meant the child lived now, somewhere in his kingdom, breathing, growing, representing everything Herod feared. He summoned the chief priests and scribes, demanding answers. Where would this Messiah be born? They consulted the prophecies, particularly Micah 5:2, and responded as recorded in Matthew 2:5-6. In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, "And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Bethlehem, a tiny village 6 miles south of Jerusalem, population perhaps 300 souls, nestled in the Judean hills. David's birthplace, the prophesied origin of the Messiah, and now, according to these foreigners, the birthplace of Herod's replacement. Herod's response was masterful in its deception. Matthew 2:7-8 captures his strategy. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." Worship. The word was poison honey on his lips. He questioned them carefully about the timing. When had this star first appeared? Their answer would determine how wide he needed to cast his net. If the star appeared 2 years ago, the child could be as old as 2. The timeline mattered. Herod was nothing if not thorough. The Magi departed for Bethlehem, following their star, unaware they had just become pawns in a tyrant's chess game. Matthew 2:11 records their arrival at the house, not a stable, suggesting time had passed since the traditional nativity scene, where they found the child with Mary, his mother. They offered gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, bowing before a toddler in a peasant home, seeing something Herod would never comprehend, divinity clothed in vulnerability. But God moved to protect his son. Matthew 2:12 records the divine intervention. Being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Simultaneously, as recorded in Matthew 2:13, an angel appeared to Joseph. "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." The Greek word used, apolisai, means to destroy utterly, to annihilate. There was no ambiguity about Herod's intentions. Joseph obeyed immediately. That night, under cover of darkness, a young couple with their toddler son became refugees, fleeing south toward the Egyptian border. Behind them, Bethlehem slept, unaware of the storm about to break. Days passed. Herod waited for the Magi's report. His informants watched the roads. His patience, never abundant, wore thin. The Magi did not return. When the realization finally struck that he had been deceived, that these foreigners had defied him, mocked him, treated the King of the Jews like a fool, something inside Herod snapped. Matthew 2:16 records the moment with terrible brevity. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. Ethimoth, The Greek conveys incandescent rage, wrath beyond reason. In his disease-racked body, in his paranoid mind, in his dying heart, fury combusted. These foreigners had humiliated him. The child still lived somewhere, growing stronger, a dagger pointed at his dynasty's throat. He could not tolerate it. He would not tolerate it. If he couldn't identify the specific child, he would kill them all. The order went out. Execute every male child 2 years old and under in Bethlehem and the surrounding region. Cast the net wide. Leave no possibility that the prophesied king might escape. It was, by Herod's standards, barely worth mentioning. His conscience, long since cauterized by decades of murder, felt no hesitation. He had killed his own sons. What were peasant children to him? To the mothers of Bethlehem, they were everything. The soldiers came at dawn, emerging from the grey light like demons from a nightmare. There were perhaps 40 male children under 2 years old in Bethlehem and its immediate vicinity, the realistic estimate based on the village's small population. Modern traditions would inflate the number to thousands, even tens of thousands, but the horrible truth was more intimate, more personal. Everyone in Bethlehem knew everyone. Every child had a name. Every mother would know every other mother's loss. The operation was systematic, efficient, perfected through Roman military precision and Herod's brutal pragmatism. Squads of soldiers, likely recruited from Herod's personal guard, men loyal to him alone, moved through the narrow streets, banging on doors, forcing entry into homes. Imagine the scene through a mother's eyes. You hear the commotion first, shouts, screams from neighboring houses, the sound of wood splintering as doors are kicked in. Your heart begins to hammer. You snatch your son from his sleeping mat, looking desperately for somewhere, anywhere to hide him. The cistern, the roof, under grain sacks. Your mind races through impossible options. The door crashes open. Armed men pour into your home. Men you might have seen in the marketplace, soldiers who maintain order, who now have orders that turn your blood to ice. They're looking for boys, only boys, 2 years old and under. You clutch your son to your chest, backing away, pleading. You offer them anything, money you don't have, information you don't possess, your own life. They are implacable, they have their orders. One grabs your arms while another tears your child from your embrace. Your son is screaming, reaching for you, calling for you. You fight with the desperation of maternal instinct, clawing, biting, kicking. It makes no difference. The soldier carries your son outside. You hear his cries mix with the screams of other children, other mothers. The sound of a village being torn apart. You smell smoke. Someone has set a house on fire. You smell blood. Then your son's cries stop. The silence is worse than the screaming. This scene repeated itself throughout Bethlehem. House after house, family after family. Soldiers systematically working through the village with the efficiency of men following orders, disconnected from the horror of what those orders meant. The methods were brutal. The artistic depictions throughout history would show swords, spears, infants dashed against stones, babies torn from mothers' arms and thrown to the ground. The reality would have been no less savage. These were soldiers trained to kill enemies of Rome, now turned against the most innocent victims imaginable. Some mothers tried to run. They grabbed their sons and fled toward the hills, hoping to hide in caves, in grain fields, anywhere away from the slaughter. Some were caught. Others watched from hiding places as soldiers searched, listening to their baby's breath and praying for silence, knowing that one cry would mean death. Fathers, held at spear point or beaten back, could only watch. The shame of powerlessness, the rage of forced complicity, the knowledge that their sons were dying while they stood helpless. This was a torment designed to break men's spirits. The operation took hours. By mid-morning it was finished. The soldiers departed, leaving behind a village in ruins, not physical ruins, but something far worse. Every family with young sons had been shattered. Bodies lay in streets, in homes, gathered by weeping parents. The smallest coffins, the heaviest to carry. Matthew 2:17-18 records the theological interpretation, "Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more." Ramah, a height from which sound carries. The reference was to Jeremiah 31:15, originally lamenting the Babylonian exile when Israelites were gathered at Ramah before deportation. Rachel, the matriarch buried near Bethlehem, symbolically weeping for her descendants. Now the prophecy found new horrible fulfillment. The sound of Bethlehem's grief echoed across the hills, a wailing that reached heaven itself. They refused to be comforted because their children were no more. The Hebrew concept of mortality here, einenu they are not, carried the finality of death, the absolute absence of loved ones, the unbearable reality that these children would never grow, never marry, never carry on family lines. The professional mourning women, customary at funerals, were overwhelmed. Their usual lamentations seemed inadequate, hollow. This was grief beyond ritual, beyond tradition, beyond consolation. The Jewish law required burial the same day. But how do you bury 40 children in one day? Families prepared bodies with trembling hands, washing the small limbs, anointing with oil they could barely afford, wrapping in whatever linen they could spare. The rituals, meant to honor the dead and comfort the living, became mechanical acts performed in shock. Some mothers refused to let go of their sons' bodies, clutching them long after death, needing to be gently, forcibly separated. The processions to the tombs blurred together. Normally, a funeral involved the whole community, a public display of grief and support. But when everyone is grieving, when every family has lost someone, the communal support fractures. There weren't enough hands to carry all the biers, enough voices to recite all the prayers, enough tears to properly mourn. The tombs, kokim carved into hillsides with narrow slots for bodies, received their smallest inhabitants. In a year, tradition dictated, families would return to collect the bones and place them in ossuaries. But these bones would require the smallest boxes, inscribed with names that would never achieve manhood, never accomplish deeds, never be remembered except as victims. The 7 days of Shiva, intensive mourning where families sat on the ground, heads covered in ash, abstaining from washing or work, became communal paralysis. The entire village sat together in shock. Neighbors who would normally bring the meal of condolence were themselves in mourning. The social fabric that held communities together frayed under the weight of collective trauma. Questions tormented the survivors. Why? Why my son? Why not the family down the street with only daughters? What had their boys done to deserve this? Nothing. They had done nothing. They were innocents in the truest sense, children who had committed no sin, made no choices, simply had the misfortune of being born male in Bethlehem at the wrong moment in history. Some mothers spiraled into madness. Some fathers turned to violence, plotting futile revenge against a king who would die soon anyway from disease. Some families simply left, unable to remain in a place saturated with memory and grief. And slowly, quietly, a rumor began to circulate. One family had escaped. A young couple with a son, perhaps 2 years old. They had fled to Egypt before the massacre. Some said they had been warned by God. Their son had survived while all the others died. The response was complex, conflicted. Relief that at least one child had escaped, anger that they had been warned while others weren't, jealousy from grief, questions that had no answers. Why was he chosen to live while our sons died? The theological implications would be debated for millennia. Were these children martyrs? First martyrs of Christianity, dying in place of Christ, though they never knew his name? The Church would eventually declare them saints, commemorating them on December 28th as the Holy Innocents. But for the mothers of Bethlehem, theological significance was cold comfort against the ache of empty arms. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Joseph and Mary heard reports of the massacre. Perhaps from other refugees, perhaps from travelers returning from Judea. They learned that children had died, children the same age as Jesus, children in their hometown, children whose parents they knew. Mary, who had pondered divine mysteries in her heart since the angel's annunciation, now pondered this horror. Her son lived because other sons died. How does a mother process such knowledge? The guilt, the gratitude, the grief, all tangled together in a knot that prayer alone couldn't untie. Joseph, charged with protecting this family, must have wrestled with questions of providence and justice. He had obeyed the angel's warning, but what of the other fathers who received no warning? Was his obedience righteousness or merely fortune? Did his family deserve salvation more than theirs? The angel had said, Herod is about to search for the child, to destroy him. Destroy. Apolisai. Utter annihilation. Herod had indeed searched, and though Jesus escaped, the search left devastation in its wake. Herod died shortly after, in the spring of 4 BCE. His death was as grotesque as his life had been cruel. The disease consuming him reached its final stages. Josephus describes his final days in horrifying detail. Unimaginable pain, attempted suicide, giving orders from his deathbed to have prominent Jews executed upon his death so the nation would mourn. That last order was mercifully ignored by his sister Salome. When the news reached Egypt, recorded in Matthew 2:19-20, the angel returned to Joseph, Rise, take the child, and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. The Greek plural, those who sought, might include more than Herod, perhaps acknowledging all who participated in his murderous schemes. But fear remained. Herod's son Archelaus now ruled Judea, and cruelty often breeds true. Matthew 2:22 records that Joseph, when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. So the Holy Family settled in Nazareth, an obscure village in the northern territory. Jesus would grow up far from Bethlehem, the site of his birth and the site of a massacre committed in his name. Did he know the story? Surely. Jewish culture passed down histories orally, and this was history written in blood. As Jesus grew, he would have understood that his life was purchased, in a sense, by the deaths of innocents, that his escape meant others' captivity, that he lived in the shadow of the smallest coffins. This knowledge would shape his understanding of his mission. The pattern was established from his infancy, the innocent suffering for the guilty, the righteous dying in place of sinners, sacrifice as the mechanism of salvation. The massacre was, in terrible symmetry, a foreshadowing of the cross. Matthew's Gospel, written decades later for a Jewish audience, deliberately structured the infancy narrative to echo and fulfill Old Testament patterns. Just as Pharaoh had ordered Hebrew babies killed and Moses escaped to become the deliverer, so Herod ordered Bethlehem's babies killed, and Jesus escaped to become the ultimate deliverer. The parallel was intentional, the message clear. Jesus was the new Moses, the final prophet, the promised king who would lead his people not from Egyptian slavery, but from sin's bondage. The theological framework Matthew constructed around the massacre emphasized multiple prophecies fulfilled: Micah 5:2, the Messiah's birth in Bethlehem; Jeremiah 31:15, Rachel weeping for her children; Hosea 11:1. Out of Egypt, God would call his son the unspecified prophets, declaring he would be called a Nazarene. Each prophecy woven together created a tapestry showing divine sovereignty working through human evil. Herod's attempt to thwart God's plan not only failed, but actually advanced it. Jesus was called out of Egypt, just as Israel had been. The massacre, horrific as it was, could not prevent the salvation God intended to accomplish through his Son. But what of the children themselves? Christian tradition honors them as the first martyrs, the Santi Innocenti, celebrated in liturgy and art throughout church history. They died unwittingly, unknowingly, their sacrifice unintended. Yet they died because of Christ, in place of Christ, pointing toward Christ. Their deaths testified to the threat Jesus posed to earthly powers and the lengths to which those powers would go to preserve their thrones. The massacre also revealed the nature of evil in sharp relief. Herod's action was not complex or ambiguous. It was pure evil, the murder of innocents to preserve illegitimate power. There was no greater good defense, no trolley problem ethics, no moral gray area. It was wrong, period. And in that clarity, it demonstrated what Christ came to destroy, sin in its rawest form. Yet even here God's providence operated mysteriously. The children died, but humanity gained a savior. Temporary loss, eternal gain. The calculus is cold, unsatisfying, even obscene to those who weep. The mothers of Bethlehem didn't care about theological frameworks or redemptive purposes. They wanted their sons back, and that tension between divine sovereignty and human suffering, between cosmic purposes and individual grief, remains unresolved. The Bible itself doesn't explain it away. The book of Job established that God owes no explanations to his creatures, yet God also validated Job's anguished questions and condemned his friends' pious platitudes. The massacre of the innocents invites both trust in God's ultimate goodness and honest confrontation with the problem of evil. What we know with certainty is this: Jesus never forgot. Throughout his ministry, he welcomed children when others dismissed them. "Let the little children come to me," he said in Matthew 19:14, "for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." He declared in Matthew 18:3 that, "Unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." His tenderness toward children perhaps reflected his knowledge of the children who died for him, and when he hung on the cross, the title King of the Jews mockingly nailed above his head, the same title that had triggered Herod's rage, he became the final innocent victim. The massacre found its completion at Calvary, where God's own Son died in place of the guilty. The pattern established in Bethlehem culminated on Golgotha. The children of Bethlehem died because a tyrant feared losing his throne. Christ died to secure an eternal throne and offer it freely to all who would believe. Their deaths were forced, his was chosen, theirs unexpected, his prophesied from the foundation of the world. In the resurrection, Christianity affirms that death doesn't have the final word. The smallest coffins of Bethlehem, heavy as they were, could not hold back the dawn of Easter. The children who died would live again, not just in memory or honor, but in restored bodies in a renewed creation where Herod's like would trouble no more. The massacre of the innocents echoes through history as a reminder of tyranny's brutality and innocence's vulnerability. Every age has its Herods, rulers who sacrifice the helpless to maintain power, who murder rather than risk sharing authority, who value thrones more than lives. Every age has its Bethlehems, places where the innocent suffer for political calculations, where blood stains ground made sacred by prophecy, where mothers weep for children who are no more. But every age also has its providences, moments where God moves to protect, to preserve, to advance purposes that human evil cannot ultimately thwart. The baby who escaped Herod grew into the man who proclaimed good news to the poor, liberty to captives, and recovery of sight to the blind. The refugee from Bethlehem became the hope of the world. The smallest coffins remind us that redemption is costly, that salvation is not cheap grace purchased without pain, that the kingdom of God advances through suffering before it arrives in glory, that the King of Kings first wore a crown of thorns before wearing a crown of sovereignty. And the mothers who refused to be comforted, Rachel weeping across the centuries, remind us that faith doesn't erase grief, that trust in God's goodness coexists with honest lament, that we serve a God who weeps with those who weep and ultimately promises to wipe every tear from every eye. The darkness of that dawn in Bethlehem couldn't extinguish the light that had come into the world. Herod's steel couldn't pierce God's purpose. Death couldn't prevent the arrival of life. Matthew concludes his account of these events with a simple statement about Jesus settling in Nazareth, fulfilling yet another prophecy. The narrative moves on, the story continues, the child grows. But the mothers of Bethlehem never forgot, and neither should we.